So this is the topic of my talk today: delusion, reality, and intersubjectivity. And now, I guess many of you have read the paper, and I tried to give an extract of this paper, which is a bit more encompassing, starting with the predominant psychiatric paradigm today, which is certainly a paradigm focused on the patient as an individual with a more or less clearly defined brain dysfunction. And on this view, delusions, because they misrepresent reality, must somehow be in the head, and they're usually being defined as false personal beliefs about external reality. Now, my approach to delusion will be a different one. In my view, delusions should be considered as intersubjective phenomena in two respects. Delusions manifest themselves primarily as failures of communication. That's how we encounter delusions in clinical practice. So we do not arrive at a shared definition of the situation we are both in with the patient, through mutual perspective taking. And second, on a deeper level, delusion may be regarded as a failure to co-constitute reality, that means of implicit intersubjectivity. This has also been variously interpreted in terms of a loss of background certainties, loss of common sense, a loss of we intentionality, or of basic trust. Now, a short overview. I start with a short account of the constitution of reality through inactive perception. Then I move to the co-constitution of reality through implicit or transcendental intersubjectivity. I could also say it's an inter-inactive account of perception. And then I use these concepts to analyze the disturbance of reality constitution in schizophrenic delusion. Now, as I said, the standard account of delusions regards them as mistaken beliefs, with the underlying assumption that there is an external reality, which is given to us through representations in our minds or in our brains. Now, this fundamental assumption of an internal representational domain is challenged by the inactive approach. According to this approach, reality is not something predetermined and external, but it is continuously constituted by a living being's sensory-motor interaction with its environment. And in the case of humans, this includes the constitution of a shared reality through social interactions. I think the main tenets of the inactive approach are well known. Living beings, so the concept suggests, living beings constitute or enact their world through a process of sense making. That means through their ongoing sensory-motor interaction with the environment. Now we could ask, if the world is constituted for us through our own interactive sense making, then how can this interaction present us the objects themselves? So if we are entangled with the environment, how can we really arrive at something like an objectivity of perception? Now, an essential presupposition for this is the constant shifting of perspectives through self-movement, so that we move around objects, that we grasp them, that we turn towards them, and so on. And this constant interaction creates a sensory-motor skill. Over time, it becomes part of our body's habitual knowledge and anticipations. So what the environment enables and affords, and how it changes depending on our actions, all this is already anticipated in our body, in our perception. So as Husserl has shown, we perceive a house not just as looking not just by looking at its visible aspects, but we also implicitly anticipate its invisible aspects that we would see if we move around the house. And therefore, my experience of the reality of an object depends on the horizon of possible further experiences with this object. An important part of this is object permanence, acquired through sensory-motor interactions in early childhood. This means objects, as we imply, as we assume, objects will continue to exist also during our absence, also if we turn away from them. That is not just a matter of course. It has to be experienced. It has to become a part of our habitual knowledge. That is object permanence. Now, as we have seen, perception doesn't present just images or appearances, but the full objects, because it is part of our embodied engagement in the world. However, there's still another level of objectivity which is characteristic of human perception. In perceiving the house, we experience it not only as an object of our possible engagement, of skilled coping, moving towards it, going upstairs, opening the door, etc. But we also perceive it as independent of our present perception. So objects are given not only for us, they are not only there for me in the immanence of my subjectivity, but they are given as such, as objects. So Berkeley's essay is percipi, so being is being perceived. That might be an idealistic philosophical assumption, but it does certainly not correspond to our experience of perception. So nobody would get the idea that objects only emerge through his perception. But how is this independence possible? Now, Husserl's later answer to this question referred to the intersubjectivity of perception. The house that I see is also a possible object for others who could see it simultaneously from other sides. That means that there is an apperceptive horizon of possible experiences, my own and those of others. And this is what turns the mere subjectivity of my experience into an open or implicit intersubjectivity. That means that in perceiving, we always enact, that's a typo, enact, I should read. We always enact and inhabit a space that we share with others. More fundamentally, according to Husserl, objectivity depends on transcending my private sphere of subjectivity, and this primarily occurs in the encounter with the other. It is the otherness of the other which grounds my experience of objectivity. Indeed, it grounds my perceptual faith in a world that exists also independent of my own perception. So the other need not be present in order for us to see the environment with others' eyes. So even Robinson Crusoe on his island, being lonely there for 10 years, saw it always with others' eyes. Now, in inactive terms, this implicit or transcendental intersubjectivity may be interpreted as resulting from a history of shared or participatory sense-making that goes back to early childhood. From birth on, the presence and the meaning of objects are continuously established social interactions, particularly including situations of joint attention and joint practices of dealing with objects, of coping with the world. So in this sense, reality is co-constituted or inter-enacted from the beginning. And on this level of reality constitution, the second level, The equivalent to the bodily movement and contrast of spatial viewpoints on the first level is now social perspective taking. So we also have a kind of shift of perspectives, but it's not given by our bodily movement in relation to objects, but it is given by our virtual movement in social perspective taking. Because this suspends and lets us transcend our own subjective perspective, and it suspends the individual's primary self-centrality. It enables perspectival flexibility. So intersubjectivity is based on the ability, on the capacity to oscillate between one's egocentric perspective and an allocentric or decentered perspective. And this may also be summarized as reaching the eccentric position, term coined by the German philosopher Helmut Plessner, to denote a higher level stance from which both perspectives can be integrated, the allocentric and the egocentric perspective. Now, besides this capacity of perspective taking, there's also another essential precondition for shared reality, namely an implicit, taken for granted background to all social interaction. And it consists of the fundamental assumptions or axioms of everyday life, the bedrock certainties mentioned by, termed by Wittgenstein, the common sense as all of those basic certainties, but also shared habitualities, forms of interaction, which are embodied rather than explicitly taught in the process of socialization. And what belongs to this background is a basic trust in the world and in others that we also develop from infancy through interaction with our caregivers. Now, let me summarize all this. Perception, as I said, overcomes the centrality and boundedness of the subjective perspective by a decentering that occurs on two interrelated levels. On the first level, the sensory-motor interaction with the environment implies a mobility of perspectives that relativizes the momentary coupling of organism and environment. And on the second level, the social interaction with others implies a virtual shifting and contrast of perspectives, which helps us to overcome a merely subject-centered worldview. On both levels, an individual's history of interactions is sedimented in his implicit memory. On the first level, this means the body's capacity of skillfully coping and of being familiar with the world. And on the second level, this means the habitual structure of being with others, implicit or open intersubjectivity. So through open intersubjectivity, humans definitely transcend the subjectivity of their centric perspective, and they gain access to a shared world. In this sense, human reality is always co-constituted or enacted through participatory sense-making. Now, what's the significance of all this for delusions? I will start my analysis by looking at the characteristic phenomena at the beginning of schizophrenic psychosis, which amount to a radical subjectivation of perception. As is well known, in the pre-delusional atmosphere or delusional mood, the patients experience their surroundings as strangely unreal, as if they were seeing only artificial images instead of real objects. It all looks unnaturally, and it all feels like being in the center of an uncanny staging. Wherever you're looking, a patient reports, everything already appears unreal. The whole environment, everything becomes strange and you get terribly frightened. Somehow everything is suddenly there for me, being arranged for me. Everything around you suddenly refers to you. You're in the center of a plot, like in a scenery. Everything feels oppressive. take this table or these walls, they are strange. Everything looks phony. But it's not only here. The walls in my living room also feel paper-like, as if in a set. Such Truman Show or Matrix symptoms, as they are frequently called by the patients themselves, point to a radical change of the structure of perception. The intentional direction of the field is somehow reversed. Formerly, objects kept their distance and neutrality, but now everything starts to refer to the patient, to approach him in an uncanny and oppressive way. One might say that perception no longer grasps the objects as objects, only presents their appearances. It has lost its intentional and decentering structure, and this is why the patient becomes suddenly the center of the world. Not infrequently, this subjectivation of perception culminates in the impression that the whole world depends on the subject, on the perceiver. And this would be a pathological form of Berkeley's esse est percipi, to be is to be perceived. I give 2 examples of that. Wherever I took my eyes off the hospital, whenever I took my eyes off the hospital guards, they disappeared. In fact, everything at which I didn't direct my entire attention seemed not to exist. At a party, everything seemed to originate from him or seemed to be dependent on him. If I perceive a door and then look away, then it's almost as if the door ceases to exist. And this last patient sometimes had the impression that she was the only person who really exists and she was responsible for the world to move on. All this means that we are at a kind of solipsism. If perception has lost its objectivity, and this means it's open into subjectivity, then the objects seem to exist and to move only for me, or even by my grace, because I somehow make them move or change. And with growing, and here, as we can see in the patient's reports, object permanence acquired in early childhood and having become a transcendental structure of perception is even lost again. Objects seem to depend on me. And with growing subjectivation, the act of perceiving itself may come to awareness. And the patients become like spectators of their own perceptive processes. I saw everything like a film camera. For me, it was as if my eyes were cameras, and my brain would still be in my body, but somehow as if my head were enormous, the size of a universe, and I was in the far back, and the cameras were at the very front. So I was extremely far away from the cameras. Well, that may be illustrated like this. In any case, the subject here obviously gets in a position outside of the world. He literally becomes a homunculus within the head, looking at his own perceptions like at projected images. Now, I turn now to the transition of these primary stages into full-blown delusion. For this, we can take the following typical case. A patient reports, it seemed ever more unreal to me, like a foreign country. And then it occurred to me that this was no longer my familiar environment. It might be no longer our house. Someone might set this up for me as a scenery, or maybe it could be transmitted to me as a television play. And then I touched the walls in order to check whether this was really a surface. Getting more and more terrified by this loss of perceptual faith, the patient was finally struck by the sudden evidence that a foreign secret service had abused her for experimental purposes and projected fake images into her brain via rays. As we can see, the subjectivation of perception that we have dealt with before already prefigures the loss of intersubjectivity that we find in full-blown delusion. On the background of an intolerable ontological uncertainty, the relieving effect of the delusion is based on the fact that it converts the transcendental disturbance of perception into an inner-worldly occurrence, namely an assumed persecution by mundane enemies and powers. Now the patients suddenly know what it's all about, what they before couldn't understand at all. So the disturbance of perception is converted into a reframing, into a reinterpretation of the perceived content, and a new objectivity is created. Sense-making is re-established, as the German term Wahnsinn indicates, so deluded sense, but obviously in a way that is fundamentally decoupled from the shared world. And we look at this now in terms of a loss of open intersubjectivity. The transition to full-blown delusional conviction is marked by a typical change of attitude and language, namely a loss of the as-if. At first, the patients still maintain a critical distance to their experiences, which is usually expressed in as-if clauses. It only seems as something extraordinary is going on. And this implies the preserved capacity to shift one's perspective and to take an external point of view from which what seems to be the case cannot actually be true. So there's still the eccentric position. But now let us look at this quote. I could no longer think the way I wanted to. It was as if one could no longer think oneself, as if one were hindered from thinking. So there's still the preservation here of as if. I had the impression that all what I think were no longer my own ideas at all, as if I wouldn't be the one who is thinking. I began to wonder whether I'm still myself or an exchanged person. But now this patient again dropped the reservation of the as if, and now came to be convinced that a criminal organization had implanted a chip in her brain to control her thoughts. So the onset of delusion is marked by a breakdown of the as-if, which implies not only a change in the degree of certainty, but also the definitive loss of open intersubjectivity as far as the delusion is concerned. The ambiguity of the "it seems as if" for the patient becomes too disturbing, too tantalizing to be maintained for a longer time. Before long, the existential anxiety and the overwhelming urge for coherence of the perceptual field enforce a disambiguation, and the delusional conviction finally locks in place. So the loss of the as-if therefore means a breakdown of the perspectival flexibility, which would still enable the patient to take a general point of view and thus to gain a distance from the situation. If we now turn to the specific interaction with a deluded patient, we find a peculiar structure of non-understanding. In normal verbal interactions, mutual understanding is achieved through reciprocal utterances, taking each other's perspectives, clarifying meanings, and so on. And in the process, we continuously shift between the ego and the allocentric perspective. However, in the conversation with the deluded patient, all these processes remain strangely futile. So when confronted with doubts or objections, the patient doesn't adequately respond. On the contrary, he will either just assume a consensual understanding of the situation, even if that is not at all the case from the other person's point of view, or he will justify his claims in a way that is not in the least sufficient for the interlocutor. So, for example, but how do you know they implanted a chip into your brain? Well, I just can feel it. Or he may even not attempt to make himself understood at all. It's pointless. I just know it, that's all. So at the latest, at this point, we realize that we have lost common ground. Our normal understanding of reality is based on a bedrock of fundamental certainties, or assumptions that we rely upon without explicit awareness. But this this background is based on an accumulated experience which has sedimented into our implicit knowledge and expectations, and results, for example, in an everyday biology which simply exclude that chips in brains could be sending thoughts into people's brains. However, we act on the background of these certainties, not because we have ever concluded or made sure that they are true. They're just self-evident for us. We rely on them, we trust others. However, for the deluded patient, this background has fundamentally changed. With the radical subjectivation of his perception, the basic trust in the shared world has been shattered, and common sense has lost its validity. As I've shown already, the emergence of delusion turns the radical subjectivation of experience into a new objectivity. That means into a new self-evidence. And now the patient cannot doubt these new certainties either. This would just not make sense for him. The new certainties are outside of any possibility of doubt or justification, no different from the certainties that we rely upon in our world. But this means that the deluded patient has lost the background of implicit intersubjectivity and common sense on which mutual understanding is ultimately based. No rational argument whatsoever is valid any longer once the shared frame of reference is lost. This could mean that delusions are indeed incomprehensible, as Jaspers argued. However, I think this claim may be too strong. After all, it's still possible to patient's utterances into our own language, provided that we take the transformation of the patient's world into account, that we understand the change in the world and the structure of the world, as I've tried to do it here. Then it may still be possible, and it can still be possible, to understand how one might feel in such a situation, and at least have a first contact, a first understanding that helps to bridge the gap between the two worlds. To conclude, I have shown in the first part that the constitution of reality is based on two levels. First, on the level of sensory-motor interaction of organism and environment, on embodiment, obviously. And second, on the dialectic between subjectivity and intersubjectivity, played out in social interaction, in participatory sense-making, or intersubjectivity. In human perception, both levels are inseparably linked, and through a twofold decentering, they together constitute the objectivity of perception. So we live in a world of objects because we enact it through our sensory-motor engagement. And we live in a shared objective reality because we continuously enact it through our joint engagements and participatory sense-making. Moreover, this co-constitution of reality has become a part of our human, of the transcendental structure of our perception, as an implicit intersubjectivity. So even in the absence of others, my perceptions always imply their possible presence. I've analyzed how in the beginning of psychosis, the decentering structure of perception breaks down, leading to a subjectivation of the perceptual field, to an inversion of intentionality, and thus to a fundamental derealization. In delusion, the intersubjective co-constitution of meaning is finally sacrificed in favor of a new coherence of the perceptual field, even at the price, still of course at the price of a loss of understanding, of mutual understanding. The loss of the as-if signifies this decisive step of a decoupling of subjectivity from open intersubjectivity. I've also pointed out in the paper to an interesting quote of Pierre Janet. Sorry? Somebody speaking. I've pointed to a quote of Pierre Janet, who points out that any belief is ultimately a promise of action. So any belief is something that we implicitly could point out, that we could point to, that could be transformed into actions. So a readiness to act is what constitutes our normal belief, and this is inherently intersubjective. So what we believe to be the case, even more what is part of our immediate perceptual faith in reality, must not only in principle be accessible to others, it should always be open for a shared practical engagement as well. Delusion is at least partially decoupled from sensorimotor engagement. It doesn't imply an action readiness. Even more, it doesn't enable an inter-inactive relation to shared reality. What the patients experience, so being implanted chips in their brains, hearing voices and the like, all this cannot be shown to others. And therefore, they usually do not even assume that it lends itself to intersubjective examination. One might indeed argue that the so-called delusional beliefs are not beliefs in the epistemic sense at all. They lack the basis of a shared or we intentionality. Although there are certainly important differences, we may finally conclude that the fundamental alteration of experience at the roots of schizophrenic delusions resemble in many respects the state of dreaming. For here, the subject becomes the center of the world. All situations show a self-referential significance. The shared world is replaced by a private world of figments and imaginations, which are not recognized as such, and which lack the reservation of an as-if. Just think of the world of dreaming. It is a world which the Greek philosopher Heraclitus famously termed the idios cosmos, so the idiosyncratic world of the dreamer, which he contrasted to the koinos cosmos, the common world of daytime. And his famous quote is, "The waking have one common world, but the sleeping turn aside, each into a world of his own." Well, I've tried to show that understanding the constitution of reality and the change of reality experience in schizophrenic beginning psychosis may enable the psychiatrist at least to help the patient somehow awake from his dreams, somehow step over the bridge to the common world. And that would be an important, or the most important goal for any interaction with a psychotic patient. Thank you for your attention.